That Triathlon Show 319. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and first of all, I hope that your 2022 is off to a great start. And hopefully this great science-packed interview about cycling and endurance sports can make it even better and more enjoyable. On today's episode, I interview Dr. Peter Leo, who is a sports scientist and cycling coach from Austria. As part of his PhD research, Peter did extensive work in profiling performance and physiological characteristics of under-23 cyclists. So in this interview, we discuss this work as well as a lot of the general aspects and practical advice and takeaways around power profiling and also using critical power. But before we get into the interview with Peter, big thanks to our sponsors, Roka. Roka produce exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, performance sunglasses, and prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. If you want to go faster in the water or on the bike, a Roka wetsuit or tri-suit might be for you. Or if you just want to have a more comfortable, functional, and stylish pair of eyeglasses, then look to their range of eyewear. Today I want to highlight Roka's Sim shorts, which are neoprene shorts to add buoyancy in the pool. This has several benefits in that it allows you to train the specific body position of swimming in a wetsuit without having to actually bring the wetsuit to the pool. It allows you to learn and understand good body position if that's something you struggle with. And it can also help you add more swimming volume, in particular when your legs are tired and sinky from bike and run training. And it can also help you better work on other points for improvement in your stroke than just body position when the shorts take care of body position for you, for example, focusing on a particular aspect of your stroke mechanics. The Sim shorts are brilliant quality shorts. They have great buoyancy and are extremely durable. I can highly recommend them. Visit roka.com/TTS for 20% off your order. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 indoor swim trainer is a one-of-a-kind swim bench that helps you improve your technique, power, and stamina. Improve your technique through an early catch, maximize your propulsion through a more powerful stroke, and stay consistent by doing swim workouts at home even when you can't go to the pool. The Zen8 swim trainer is available in the UK, EU, and the US, with free shipping in both the UK and the US. It is very affordable, it's similar to a pair of running shoes, and best of all, the investment is completely risk-free. If you're not in love with the Zen8 swim trainer after 2 weeks of using it and using their free program, you can send it back and get a full refund. Learn more and get a 20% additional discount on your swim trainer on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Dr. Peter Leo. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Peter. How are you doing this morning?
Thanks, Michael, for the invitation. I'm great, and even greater to have a podcast with you this morning.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm looking forward to it as well. You've recently defended your PhD thesis, so that's what we'll get into and discuss. But before getting into the details of that, can you give us a general overview of yourself, who you are, what your background is in endurance sports and in academia?
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Peter Leo. I'm from Austria, the western part of Austria in Tyrol. We had the World Championship in 2018 in Innsbruck. So I'm not far away from Innsbruck. I actually graduated from the University of Innsbruck. So this is why I also know Tour of the Alps as a spectator earlier on with Giro del Trentino. And in 2007, there was in our valley, there was a stage, final stage of the Giro d'Italia. So I was always a bit in the heart of the Alps. I'm coming from triathlon. I used to be a competitive triathlete national level in Austria. I competed a bit in Germany, Italy. That's my sporting background. But I'm more involved in cycling, but also in triathlon as a coach, but also as an applied sports scientist.
Great. And to give an overview of your PhD work, can you describe just at a very high level what you investigated?
Yes, due to my commitment to an under-23 development team, I was always curious about the physiological and performance requirements of under 23 cyclists, as there was a quite big research deficit in this kind of area. There was some really good studies from junior cycling. Of course, other groups like Tour van Erp and Deo did a tremendous job in professional cycling and also investigating those key performance indicators. But I realized at that time, and it was in late 2018, where I took up my PhD research, I realized that there was quite a big gap in the most important link between junior and elite, which is under 23 level. So this was my dedication and also my motivation to then go for a PhD. We entitled Longitudinal Physiological and Performance Characteristics in under 23 cyclists.
Yeah, and I'll link to all of the papers included in the show notes, so listeners can go and have a look. There's 5 papers that you've basically included there, but for today's interview, I thought we'll focus on 3 of them in particular, or 3 topics that are loosely based, well, quite tightly based around 3 of the papers. So first, let's discuss power profiling, because you did power profiling in many of these studies of these under 23 cyclists, but at a general level, you also had a narrative review where you discussed kind of the best practices of it and how to use it. So let's start there. What is power profiling and what are the reasons for doing it?
Yeah. I was always interested in power profiling as an athlete myself. I worked for SRM as an internship all alongside Garth Fox in the French Alps for 2015 alongside the Tour de France, where we analyzed performance data at that time. So this was my first contact with really using power output as an information for explaining endurance performance. And due to my studies, I got more and more into power profiling. I got introduced into the critical power concept and different methods of assessing power profiling in the field. And it's basically, there are various ways of doing it. And this is also what I figured out during my PhD. It's similar to a lot of other scientific debates. It's about adding valuable information to a certain field. I don't say that this information, what we added, is the right one to go with, but at least we tried to make it as clear as possible in order to provide a robust framework of also the underlying physiology and how it is linked to endurance performance.
So what recommendations did you come up with in the end in terms of how to do power profiling and avoid some common pitfalls that you might otherwise have?
Yeah, I think the most important thing regarding power profiling is there is a kind of misconception going around that power profiling is just getting connected a power meter, uploading your activity to Strava or other platforms, and then using that information, what you get from a device in order to produce your basically power duration curve. And that is not necessarily what explains a lot of the physiological information, or basically the performance physiological information. And this is why it's always important to use some kind of formal form. I always say formal testing. I would even, maybe you can also say standardized testing. So rather than just going Wild West into your racing and training and try to retrieve everything what you can get out, you should have a clear, I think a clear concept of what you are approaching in terms of what is your test, what are you going to test in the field, what are you testing in the laboratory, and how can this then be explored with field data using racing information, training information, and so on. So this is what we say. It's a multifaceted approach.
Yeah, it makes sense, because something you explore in the paper is that, especially when comparing the power data from training versus racing, you see that, well, the cyclists basically never reach their actual maximum power in training that they can achieve in racing. So for example, during the during the preparatory phase where you don't have any races, if you just rely on the power duration curve from training data, you actually underestimate what power they are capable of doing. It's just the power duration curve, used that way, is just a measure of what has been done, not what can be done.
Exactly, totally agree. And we have always a bit of a conflict because as you as an engineer, I'm not the guy who can program a lot. I'm not the guy who is really into modern use of technology. I can hardly write a Python script and an R script. I just managed to do my starts with RStudio. That's all I can do from a machine learning programming side. So, but I'm very limited to Excel, and there is a quite a good mate of James, Jamie Pringle, who his philosophy, I'm not sure if it's still, but his philosophy is, from an applied perspective, the thing he cannot do in Excel, just don't do it. So no,
that's actually not a bad not a bad philosophy.
So we love Excel, and everything I can do with Excel is great. No, but what I'm saying is that the conflict what you have, and I have been in a lot of discussion at conferences or in other fields where you have engineers and also guys coming from, or guys and girls, I would say, not only guys, coming from more the engineering side, mathematical side, statistical and modeling side. They all say, yeah, I can get this out. I can get this model out and this model out. And then at the end, you're just talking about models, but you always forget it's human physiology, and you need to find a way to backlink it with, okay, what are we looking at? What are physiological responses to that power output? And that is often missed. So at the end, you just have like arbitrary models which don't explain necessarily what endurance performance is. And we really want to stress that back and say, hey guys, it is important that we face, due to we are working with humans, the underlying physiology, because this needs to be explained by the end from power output data, at least to a certain extent. And this is why, and it always amazes me. It amazed me since I was a bachelor student, but it's still, I'm still, and I'm not the only one for sure. It's the critical power model, which is still one of the best investigated since his very huge history, to use it as a bioenergetic model, especially in certain intensity domains.
Yeah. So I think that's a nice segue into the critical power, and I guess we can lead from where you said there that you are a fan of using some sort of standardized testing or formal testing, and that is maybe the critical power test that you're talking about, because then you get several points on the power duration curve if you do that as a standardized practice. So can you talk about that? Like how would you recommend going about doing a critical power test and use that information?
Yes. There have been other very more famous authors and researchers on your podcast who know tremendous amount more than me regarding the critical power concept, like Andy Jones, Mark Burnley, Phil Skiba with a recent podcast. But what I think when it's coming down to critical power testing, you have to be aware of with which kind of population are you doing it. Because I totally agree when you do it, and I experience it with sports students at the moment who are not really familiar to pacing and don't have a lot of experience with going all out. You need to have at least, I would say, 4 to 5 prediction trials in order to use or to reduce the error in your model. However, when you have like top level endurance athletes, especially cyclists who really know how to go all out on a predefined duration, or they should, you can reduce the number of predictions in order to still have an accurate model. And I think this was quite well described by Mehdi Cordis-Baber, but also Felipe Macchioni with the co-workers showed this, how it can be approached. So I don't want to go too much into the methodology of CP trials, but at the end, it's important that the trial selection is carefully considered. So all efforts need to be should be within the severe intensity domain, where we can say basically it should theoretically, or when you go into a lab, they should achieve VO2 max. So that's an absolutely important consideration. And then you're automatically left with a quite limited time range. So we know we hardly can achieve, or I think there is very little data who show that you can achieve VO2 max within less than two minutes. So this is where you automatically are at the lower end, or the shorter end is 2 minutes, and probably the longer end is 15 minutes, and that gives you the duration where you should select appropriate length, and there is some common sense that the shortest and the longest should at least have 5 to 7 minutes of time difference.
Yeah. So what would, for example, when you've been working with cyclists in an applied setting, what sort of durations have you chosen, just to give the listeners an example of that?
I initially worked from 2, 5, and 12, because this is also what we used in my master laboratory with Alfred Nimmerrichter, who did a lot into the power profiling research as well. And then I also went to more Bettina Carsten's protocols and Louis Passfield's from University of Kent with 3, 7, and 12. So this has been basically those time ranges where I did it. I never did it with 50 minutes, to be fair. So the longest duration I used have been 12 minutes. 10 minutes for the longer might be too short. So it's better to go more to 12 to 15 minutes duration. And in the shorter one is 2 to 3 minutes. I think that's the way to go with the protocols. But at the end, I think it is important. It's rather important. Then you should not really switch a lot between your protocols. It's better to stick with one protocol where you have very good experience and where you know how you find the right client for it. That's also one consideration, because we are talking exclusively here about doing this test on a standardized climb uphill between 4 to 7% on their road bikes. So we are not talking about, because you do it quite differently in a lab. You give a power output and you measure time. That's the difference. You don't give, and basically it's a time to task failure. And outside you just give a fixed time duration and then say, okay, go all out for that kind of duration. This was discussed in some papers. Basically with a trained population, you come back to, I would even say on a practical level, to very similar results, and unless you do it the same way. And I think that's the most important to stress, especially when you work with athletes. You should not go one time in a lab, then you go outside. You can compare, of course. It is always fair to compare things, especially in your explorative phase where you try to what's best working for me. But at the end, I think as soon as you have a concept, you should just follow that concept in order to really make it comparable over the periods.
Yeah, and I think there's even you can tell me, but I think there are some papers showing that the critical power changes a bit, even based on if you have slightly longer or shorter duration. So yeah, as you said, once you have those durations that you like, that are within those constraints, then just stick with them and don't change them up, because then the results could be different, even though the physiology hasn't really changed.
Exactly, and the problem is also, what people often don't acknowledge appropriately. We have a natural variation in CP. So CP is not a value of 300, for example, 318 watts, and with 390 watts you are in non-steady state, and with 370 watts you are in steady state. That's not working. And I think that there have been great blogs also by Mark Burnley showing that, and also research recently with the critical torque, that it's more like a phase transition. So basically you have day-to-day variation within your estimate. And depending on time, depending on also on motivation, I would say this phase transition is basically on the upper or lower end of that range. And I think that's important to consider, that it's, and this is how physiology works. It's not from one point change to another. You see it in different physiological phenomena that it's more like a phase transition, so a gradual change into homeostasis or physiological responses.
Yeah, no, I remember that blog from Mark Burnley, and I'll link to it in the show notes as well. It's a really good one. So you mentioned there having a standardized climb that you work on. What other things do you need to consider in terms of the methods? For example, do you take into account things like making sure you have the same weather and things like that? Are there any other things on a practical level that people should consider when it comes to their testing protocol?
Yes, indeed. I think choosing the right time to do it in the season, I think it's very crucial, because the athlete needs to be definitely motivated, rested. So you would similar recommend the same preparation as you would go into a laboratory to do a incremental exercise test or whatever, to volitional exhaustion. So the same is basically same preparation is following for a critical power test. So you reduce volume 2-3 days before, you make some activation before, you use a standardized warm-up protocol with some priming, of course, in order to really get into it. And ideally, we could do this always, and I did it with the cyclists, always in the February training camp, because we are all together. We use 2 days of testing. The riders are motivated at that time because they really want to go into racing. They really want to go deep. So that's the ideal spot. Where I don't think it's a good idea to do it too early in the season, where you just started training, for example, and they just need to build up, because it's still all out and it requires a lot of courage for the athlete just to, and the higher the performance level, the higher or the more difficult it is to really go all out for them. Don't get sub-maximal data in your estimate. So this is why reduce it more for a limited time, but use it then quite accurately. And then we used it, of course, don't do it also in outdoor conditions with 2 to 3 degrees. I think that there is no point. So we always went to Italy in February, where we did it between 15 to 20 degrees. Of course, temperature plays a role, and also and other environmental conditions. There is a great paper by Nathan Townsend showing that how CB reduction basically due to altitude progression. So I would say you should use normal sea level or just normal altitudes up to, I would say, 700-800 meters. So you won't get any bias there in terms of the environmental conditions.
Mm. And you mentioned they're doing the test over 2 days. So you were doing the 2 shorter durations on the same day, and then the longer one you did on a separate day. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct. For research, we randomized it to get out the bias, or we just randomized it. But if I would just do it for the training process, I would go for the shorter ones on the first day and the longer ones on the second day. But you can also say, and this is what we also did in one of our attempts, we let athletes choose individually. And it's quite interesting how different type of athlete, different type of riders choose the effort trial order. So, for example, the sprinters always want to do the shorter one first and the longer one afterwards. And GC contenders, for example, or more climber types, they want to do the longer first, and then they went for the shorter ones. So that was quite interesting. It has never been investigated in our kind of investigation, but it was just what I observed when being there. And one thing what I think what I should add here is, especially for coaches, you really need to be aware of the familiarization. So if an athlete has never did a critical power test, it's similar to a Wingate test, that there is a learning effect. So I think at least they should try 1-2 CP tests in order to really make it accurate. And there is some debate. I mean, there's a lot of data how it can be used for moderately trained subjects or athletes. I think you should really be aware of that. It has also its limitation in a moderately group of athletes and the implications. So I think it really works great in a well-trained population, at least from my experience, especially in field. I think with a moderately group of students, and so it's better to do it in the laboratory. You just can control it better and also measure, for example, the responses. And I think you get away with that on an elite level.
What do you think are the potential issues with a moderately trained population doing it in the field? Is it the pacing or going all out?
I think it's just a pacing pattern. It's a pacing pattern outside, and I think in the laboratory you just can control it better on the ergometer with the resistance and so on. And then it's also, there are a lot of logistical considerations. You need to find a very quiet place when they go all out. Don't do it on a busy road. It's can get really, really dangerous. When there's heavy traffic, they go all out in the severe domain. They have like problems controlling their bike. It's like you have a responsibility when you go out as a coach and do testing with it. It's always because in racing, okay, the roads are closed and they are secured, but in testing, in most cases, it's not. So I know exactly when we are going, where to test, because I know the roads, and I figured it out before. And also on the day before, I go there and check if it's all good with the road, and is there no construction work? Because if you're just going on the bottom of the climb and you realize, okay, 2K afterwards, there is a construction work and the road ends. So, but yeah, not good choice for your test at that day. So, yeah, that needs to be, of course, for coaches, a lot of preparation also, and I think that's the way to go. Yeah.
What do you think about athletes doing a CP test at home, indoors on their trainer, especially those living in colder climates? Because then you could, in theory, you could fix the power output and do it as time to task failure, as you described for the laboratory test. But I'm not aware of people really doing that. I think that the people that do critical power testing at home just choose a time duration and do it as a time trial.
Yeah.
But what do you think is the best way to go there if people are doing it at home indoors?
You should definitely use the erg mode, probably. To have just the resistance right. The problem is, which kind of smart trainer are you doing it? It might work with the Wahoo. I'm not sure if it works with other type of rollers. When you do it in the lab, you either do it with a Lodi, a SRM ergometer, or Cyclists. That's easier because they are really high-end scientific ergometers with a great braking resistance, I think. And it's also a motivational thing. And I think you as a coach should consider, can I expect this from an athlete doing indoors? Because otherwise, it happened for me one time where I did the 3-minute all-out test, and I just said I will never do it ever again, because I rather do 3 trials of CP outside, and I just don't want to do the 3-minute. I don't want to see that experience again. There is a video I posted recently on our Twitter thread with Mark Burnley showing me basically almost collapsing and falling off the Lodi. Because I was
so you did a single trial CP
test. The 3-minute all out.
Okay.
The 3-minute all out, and guess this was like hell.
And just for listeners to explain here, the 3-minute all out doesn't mean a paced time trial over 3 minutes. It means that you start at a sprint and then you just keep every single pedal stroke is a maximum pedal stroke, and you will gradually get less and less power, and then theoretically your end power is your critical power, and then you can calculate the W prime as well as the work done above critical power. So it's a brutal kind of positively paced trial. I have never done it personally, but I imagine that it's horrible.
Yeah, and I was tempted to introduce it with the cycling team, but at the end I just said no. For me it's I just don't want to hurt the guys in that way, because it could also be negatively attached then to me when I come up again and they say, oh fuck, Peter Leo is turning up. I don't want him to be in the training camp, because that means pain, and I don't like that those cyclists associate me with pain.
Yeah. All right. So one other thing to go back to, you mentioned there that you always, in terms of fixing the time points when you do it in the season, doing one test in February during the training camp. When would you do? I know you wrote in your thesis about recommending doing 2 tests per year. When would the second one be?
Yeah, interestingly, what we saw, and we said, okay, we might come away with one test per season. So basically, at the beginning of before the first race. And I think that was the way we approached. But then we just find out that those measures the errors what we got within the season with the power profiling information derived from racing did no longer catch up basically with the preseason test, because of course you have some changes in body mass throughout the season. You get optimized, rider get lighter often or heavier, you don't know, but ideally he gets lighter due to the more racing stress, more training volume. So he's losing 2-3 kilos that could affect absolute power output. This is what we saw basically. We saw an improvement in the relative power output throughout the season, but we saw basically no change in the absolute power output. But it's still an improvement, I would say, in endurance performance, because when you improve your power to mass ratio at the end, it's always, especially for mountaineers racing, it's more advantage. So then we figured out, okay, we might need to add a second half season test. And this is what you basically do after the first season and highlight. And in this case, it was always by the end of June, early July. This was the point where we then say, okay, this might be an appropriate time after some solid 4-6 weeks build up again, do a test before you go into the second half of the season, before Tour de l'Avenir, whatever, what was following on the racing schedule for those under 23 cyclists.
Okay, perfect. And one thing that we should discuss as well is what is the reason for recommending critical power as opposed to, for example, an MLSS test or even a kind of classic 20-minute FTP test or something like that? Why is critical power what you recommend?
I think it's important, and this is also what we wrote in our review article. From a physiological perspective, you get, when you use critical power or MLSS, I'm very careful now, because yesterday a paper came out from a group debating again about what is the highest metabolic steady state. So I'm not adding any discussion on that. But what I'm just saying is, okay, because you can use, and I like the way Mark Burnley demonstrated it. You can use CP as a top-down approach in order to get the border between the severe and heavy domain. And you can use MLSS in order to get the border as a bottom-up from heavy to severe. And I think this is the way where you say, okay, you can balance those two measures. What I see basically, and I did MLSS and CP testing with that group as well. Didn't have time to publish the data yet, but it seems like the higher level the athletes are, the closer CP and MLSS are together within, I would say, 10 to 15 watts. The less people are trained, the higher I see the discrepancies between MLSS and CP. So this is the physiological perspective for the phase transition between steady state and non-steady state exercise. And there is currently some real big debate, but it's science, that's normal. And on the other hand, with just one single test, for example, a 20-minute test, an 8-minute test, whatever duration you choose, or just MLSS, it's basically referenced. Even MLSS is referenced to a 30-minute time to exhaustion, as you would say it, or time trial. It just gives you 1 point on a power duration curve. But we know a power duration curve is a second by second or whatever. In order to get that hyperbolic relationship of power output to time, you have to have multiple points. So this is you cannot really use, and you as an engineer know it's a single component. So this is why you need basically 2 parameter estimates, and critical power allows you, due to having at least 2 prediction trials, ideally 2 and more, because the problem, and I think this was also discussed in a previous podcast about the degrees of freedom and how it is analyzed statistically regarding the measurement error, because using only 2 trials gets you always a perfect linear fit, and you cannot apply the hyperbolic nonlinear CP model. But at the end, what you're getting there is you get a work above CP, so known as the W prime. The V and the apostrophe is basically just a contraction of work, and the second component is critical power. And with this basically 2 parameter estimates, you can characterize, at least for the severe intensity domain, with the 2 parameter model, you can use at least exercise prescription or time to exhaustion within the severe intensity domain for power output. So you can estimate a 3-minute all out, a 5-minute all out, an 8-minute all out, a 10-minute all out, a 50-minute all out. I think that covers the whole range of the severe domain. Of course, this approach has its limitation. It especially the 2-parameter model underestimates short power output production and long power output sustainability. We know this with the mathematical problem of the CP estimate. But at the end, it just gives you a more consensus characterization of the underlying power duration relationship.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, and you build on that power duration curve. So even if you don't necessarily think that you need to use the kind of calculate, okay, what is my predicted time to exhaustion at a particular power in the severe domain, you still get a sense of whether you are somebody who rapidly degrades in power but have a strong kind of peak, or if you're somebody who is more of a what you might call a diesel engine with a slower decay but not as high of a peak. So even without using the modeling aspects of critical power, you can still have a profiling advantage in that way.
Yes.
So yeah, and just to go back to the discussion on MLSS, well, for listeners that are not familiar, just very briefly, it's maximum lactate steady state. So it's the point where you can have a more or less constant lactate, and if you go at a higher power, then your lactate starts increasing. So
it says between the 10th and the 13th minute, it should stay below 1 millimolar.
Yeah. And Mark Burnley, I think, had some great videos on his YouTube channel.
Absolutely love it.
Physiology.
All out physiology is really something what I would recommend to everyone. Yeah. It's good learning source.
Definitely. But let's see here. So other than I think that for cycling, of course, this severe intensity domain for road cycling and other disciplines as well is super important. One thing that I would just say as a kind of limitation of critical power is that it's not necessarily super relevant for example, Ironman athletes, where something like LT1 might be the better kind of physiological marker of performance. So that's another limitation to be aware of. Like, what is your discipline? Is work in the severe intensity domain something that is of key importance there? And if it is, then the critical power model is fantastic. If it isn't, then it's definitely not bad, but it has its limitations there.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And it's also, for short duration efforts, maybe the anaerobic power reserve is a more appropriate way of scaling power output for track cycling, for example. But I think this is very important to know each model's limitation. And as you said, and at the end, don't get obsessed with too much modeling. I think you still get a lot of information from the training process itself with some kind of standardized interval, athlete feedback, and so on. So I think we are always too much focused on that. We want to explain too much via a single model, and we forgot other very important components, especially in the long end, regarding nutrition, regarding motivation, regarding environmental conditions, and so on, equipment, for example. So I think you have to be aware of how you can use it, but as long as you acknowledge, for everything its limitations, I think it's a fair way to go with it.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to move on to the power changes in the under 23 cyclists. But before we do that, can you just give a summary of what we talked about here with power profiling and critical power? A few practical tips that you want the listeners to kind of remember and take away from this part of the interview.
Yes. So basically, if you approach critical power testing in a season, select the time at which you want to test critical power quite wisely. It should be close to the start of the season. I think this is what you get really accurate and very good measures. Use at least 2 to 3 prediction trials, and be aware that there should be some pre-familiarization with all-out type of exercise. Make sure that the recovery between those different prediction trials within a session should be at least 30 minutes, ideally 30 to 40 minutes, in order to ensure adequate recovery between those different all-out efforts. use a standardized climb, a safe climb with less traffic, check before, and also consider, outdoor conditions like cold, humidity, altitude, and so on. So I think that's the most important way. And then when you can analyze it, you can do it very simply with just plotting it on Excel with the linear models, or use some kind of very good shiny apps from Felipe Mattioni with the CP calculator, which basically gives you from the non-linear to the linear models everything what you have, inclusively the standard errors and all the statistical fits, goodness of fit.
I'm not familiar with those apps, so that would be cool to.
It's a great app.
Out.
So Felipe Mattioni is really the guy who basically shares open knowledge and everything. So I'm using even his kind of apps for Lactate analysis. Now he got out a threshold app, which is very cool, and also critical power calculator.
Great. Yeah. If you want to do it in Excel, then transforming to a work time model, then you can just do the linear regression and use the slope and the intercept to get the critical power and W prime. So it's pretty simple to do with a little mathematical transformations there. But let's move on to discuss the power changes in the under-23 cyclists. And what you also investigated there, I should mention, is you investigated the training characteristics and how they related to the changes in power over the season. So, can you just give an overview of how you went about doing these studies and then what you found?
This study was a follow-up from our initial one, where we just were investigating the power profiling changes within a season. And then we say, okay, but we did not really acknowledge what is training and what is racing. So then we moved on and say, okay, we divided basically efforts in training and efforts in racing, and we're basically comparing both. And then initially compared it to the CP test, which was used as a standard measure and baseline measure at the beginning of the season. And what we found is for both absolute and relative power outputs, values achieved in training are lower than what is it achieved in racing. Which is kind of common sense because, as you said initially, you don't produce real maximum efforts, even not in intervals. I would say there is also a lot of evidence that interval training prescription does not need to be necessarily, especially with high intensity training, to be all out, as you want to just achieve around time above 90% heart rate max. So that was of kind of some logical phenomenon what we observed. But interestingly, what we then want to explain is we had 3 different periods. So we were dividing the season into an early season, which was from February, when they start racing in kind of Easter spring trophy and so on, to end of April, then from May to end of July, and then we had August until October. So that was our 3-month seasonal periods. And we were then speculating about how is training affected in one period to the change in the power profiling to the next. So basically, we were looking at the delta change between periods. And we also included, of course, the off-season, the pre-season. And interestingly, what we found is, especially in the early part of the season, when they start with adding a lot of racing, the guys who even topped up their training alongside racing decline in the power profile. So in other words, when you don't manage the workload, especially in the early part of the season, you have detrimental and decline in your power outputs, for short duration, long duration. So that was quite interesting for us. And it could also be said for the mid-season. So, and this is where the most racing happens in under 23 cyclists. So the most busy season is, I would say, up to the baby Giro, which is in the mid of June. And it all goes from February to mid of June with a lot of race days there. And even then, coaches want to maintain training, but even if they maintain training too much, the residual fatigue kicks in, and basically then they are not able to be as powerful as they should be. So that was one interesting observation. And then
let's stop on that one, because I think it's a really, really interesting one. So what do you think is then the solution to that, or is the reason for that basically that there's too much racing, and if you do too much racing, then you simply can't maintain a power, your your peak performance for a long time? Or do you think that, well, maybe if they just did less training while they're racing, it could be possible to maintain? What if you speculate here, what do you think?
Yeah. That was also the consideration what we have been discussing, and because we are also working on the other side as coaches, So for us it was quite informative. But we would definitely argue that basically the race planning was going into the wrong direction for the build up for the athlete. So basically they just were going to races week by week and just adding fatigue, but not having the time to use that kind of stress what you get from racing in order to reinforce it into the training and build it up more stable. So that was the problem. And we observed this within the 2018 and 2019 season working with the team. And it's quite difficult from a coach perspective, because you have to follow that rhythm. Because at the end, these are the important races where the rider needs to shine and where they need to accumulate the race kilometers and so on. But at the other hand, you want to keep performance on the long term. So that's quite a very, very tricky question to answer. And there is no one size fits all. So there have been athletes who can accumulate it, but the tendency, and I use it quite carefully, the tendency within that under 23 group was that just racing more is adding more fatigue, is adding more detrimental performance. And that's something where I think development is also key, because team managers, teams in general, they just compare it too much with already professional cycling. But they still in their development, and they still need time to develop year by year. And the problem is that it's the racing program in a lot of those under 23 development teams now is too aggressive, at least before COVID, I would say, is too aggressive starting into the season. And then basically you're just flattening out at the end. And this is what we saw in the late season. We saw a very big variance in our power profile between riders, because the variance was just because athletes were going mad. So they could not produce anything at the end of the season. Some guys could maintain it, or some guys still managed to improve it. So that were some really interesting observations. And what the guys who improved it, they just strictly followed a very polarized training intensity distribution. So guys accumulating more time below VQ1, so the first basically aerobic threshold, and then accumulating or still having appropriate time above VT2, the anaerobic threshold, allowed them to maintain their power profile. Whereas athletes spending too much basically in those gray zone, as it's often referred, they just plateaued or even declined. And for us, that was really an informative way of how basically a longitudinal seasonal approach of training characteristics can influence at the end performance.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And was that when you looked at the training intensity distribution, was that only the training data, or was it training plus racing data?
Exactly. We did not, of course, because we always had from our approach, okay, racing is also adding stress. So it's in this kind, it's of course some kind of load. So we did not differentiate between stress from racing and stress from training. We just used basically that accumulation of workloads that was achieved in that adequate period. So there was no difference between racing and training in that kind of design.
Then there could even be an effect of different roles within the team having an unfair disadvantage or advantage, but just based on what they're kind of what they're told to do for the team in different races.
Absolutely, I would guess so. And this is necessarily what we see. Although the roles are not so strong in under 23, it's still more like everyone works from an all-rounder approach. But it's still, you see definitely then as more mature they get, as more they have roles, of course, and also ambitions to shine on that race or just use that race for a build-up. And that, of course, influenced that kind of change.
Okay, yeah. So go on. What other things did you take from this study? What other findings did you have?
Yeah, I think the most important findings were, as I said, those changes in training characteristics throughout the season, using a more polarized approach. Be careful about adding more training when you have already a very high racing density, and also make sure your athlete is aware of the long season. And that has always been a bit of a problem, especially within our team. Everyone wants to shine at the beginning, but they still forgot that there are quite important racing in September. So, for example, including the European Championships, including the World Championships, and also, the one-day races like Piccolo di Lombardia, and so on by the end of the season, which is quite still important for a lot of World Tour teams when they look for a spot who is doing well at the end of the season, because that tells you a lot about how a rider is basically progressing and how also, I'm not using that buzzword, but I just wanted to say how fatigue resistant he is already.
Yeah. No, I think that's a point that a lot of people, amateurs as well, can take something from. I definitely know that I personally have done a lot of mistakes with being maybe too fit or too peaked early on in the season, and then maybe not being able to maintain that later on in a season. And I actually remember when I read that part of your work, I kind of had an aha moment that I can kind of recognize myself in that.
Exactly.
All right. So that's those are some really, really interesting points. One follow up as well that I have. So you found in terms of the overall power profile, and I think this was in the study where you didn't differentiate between racing and training, that the absolute power, as you already said, didn't really change through the season, even though the relative power changed because some cyclists lost a little bit of weight through the season. But do you think that this is is this also maybe a result of, I don't know, peaking too early or not really having a peak because of all the racing? Because you would think that maybe we're talking about under 23 cyclists, you would kind of want to see an improvement ideally in the absolute power. So what information or what conclusions would you draw from that, and how would you change things maybe to see an increase in absolute power?
Yeah, that's the thing, and this whole project, because we had different expectations. We saw, okay, there is way more dynamic in a power profile, I would say in a fresh power profile, because these were all efforts achieved in a fresh state. However, we didn't, and this is what led us to basically that Tour of the Alps project, where we were looking into the power profile after accumulated workloads, where we find a lot of answers then for that change.
All right. So can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. We had that unique opportunity with Tour of the Alps, which is a 2-point pro racing category, known before as Giro del Trentino, which using a lot of World Tour teams as the build-up for the Giro d'Italia, which is basically 1 week after. So teams like Ineos, Astana, Bora-Hansgrohe, AG2R, FDG, and all the World Tour teams come to the big dance. And for our team, as it's a Tyrol team, and Tyrol is the sponsor of that race, with the Origio area, with South Tyrol and also Italy, then the Del Trentino, we always got a wild card for that race. And basically, this is a great opportunity to race against Thomas Cherren, Bernal, Thibaut Pinot, and all those world stars. And for the guys, it's like a great experience from a racing opportunity, but also for us, it was a great experience for a performance opportunity to look, okay, what is really required in a race. And basically the approach was we had a research cooperation with Androni, the pro continental team from Italy, with Andrea Gheorghi as the head of performance, and Dan Laurent with Bora-Hansgrohe. And basically those we got data from both teams, and we have our under 23 data. And what we were looking at is just like initially we looked at the power profile over multiple duration from 5 seconds to 30 minutes. And interestingly, we didn't find any change or any difference in the absolute power profile. Then we found some variation, of course, in the relative power profile due to that the riders selected for the World Tour teams just had more climbing-specific nature in terms of their anthropometric characteristics, and our under-3 cyclists were could be classified as just all-rounders from their anthropometrics. But interestingly, then there was an article from Nate Wilson, I think 2 years before, where he showed that evolvement of Will Parder with I think it was at that time where he went to CCC about the kilojoule approach and what they did in terms of their efforts after predefined amounts. And we were really interested in it because we know coaches are working with this approach, but it has never been administered to a research design. So we were basically quantifying the work from 1,000 kilojoule onwards up to 3,000 kilojoule, we're looking at the change in the power profile as the kilojoule were accumulated. And then this basically was a memory effect for us. Wow, there is a lot of dynamic change. And this is what we saw. The under 23 cyclists started fatiguing quite early after 2,500 kilojoule, they drop in their power profile, whereas professional riders can maintain it throughout 2,500 kilojoule. So that was the first approach. And in the second approach, we even did subdivisions of this group based on their anthropometrics into all-rounders, domestiques, and GC contenders. Basically, from an anthropometric perspective, the domestiques and the GC contenders did not differ. We just then added basically who had a supportive role and who had basically the key role. And this is why we used the top 10 for the GC contenders, and outside the top 10, these were the domestiques. And interestingly, even within professional cyclists, we see quite big discrepancies in the fatigue resistance of different rider types. Of course, there is a lot of other factors playing in: race dynamics, team tactics, race strategy, day-to-day variation. We are all aware of that limitation. So it's not about that, okay, this study was 100% controlled. It was not controlled at all. It was just observational. But I think the power, what you get out just from observational study showing this was quite impressive to us. And I think, the interest from the scientific community was also quite big. We had, a lot of interest in that project, because I think it was never really attempted. And interestingly, at the same time, another group with Deyo Sanders and Rob Lamperts did a similar paper with a kilojoule approach, a similar kilojoule approach with race points, basically coming out to the same conclusion. And honestly, in research, you can have it better. Like two independent groups showing basically the same results. And that was quite, of course, strengthening our results, but also their findings. And I think now we opened the door for something new, and we try to fill that gap now with, James Sprague's PhD and all this kind of future projects that are ahead of us.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Do you remember off the top of your head, or do you have the numbers in front of you? How much did the under 23s drop in their power profile in percentage or in watts or watts per kg compared to the seniors?
What we basically compared was how it was the power profile after pre-accumulated workloads comparative to race performance. And race performance was quantified as the UCI points scored or the percentage time difference to the overall winner. So that was our classification of race performance. And interestingly, in order to be able to hit UCI points from an under 23 level or general level, you need 5.3 watts per kilo after 2000 kilojoule over 20 minutes or longer. And that was quite an impressive marker, because I didn't know this. But when I presented these results this year in the Science and Cycling Conference in Leuven, there was Samuele Macora sitting in the audience, and he was smiling after my talk. And he raised his arm and said, "You know what, Peter? We found this out in Alberto Sassi's lab in 2005 at Marbella, and we came to the same conclusion, but we never published the results." But you know that, and that for me, that was quite an interesting memory effect. I said, wow, it's great that even though we have different approaches, different methodologies, different populations, the findings are quite robust. And more interestingly, we also found, especially for the GC contenders who wanted to go for a stage win or want to stay affiliated to the top UCI points and the minimum time difference to the winner, you need on average 5.2, 5.8 watts per kilo on the average climb in that race. And previously, this was exactly found by Tom Dumoulin's case single study from Ten Van Erp, where he also concluded during his 3-week Grand Tour, he needed 5.8 watts per kilo for 20 minutes and longer after 2,500 kilojoules. So I think that was really something interesting for us, where he said, okay, although we had quite different interests and also started differently from the approach, the results remain quite solid and quite transparent.
Yeah, and what do you think in terms of developing that fatigue resistance? What are the key things that an athlete needs to do to do that? What are the steps that people can take if they want to work on their fatigue resistance?
At the moment, we have a problem. We can classify who is fatigue resistant or not, but we don't know really what are the triggers. So it's not like in terms of polarized training or high intensity training, you need that amount of high intensity training and that amount of low intensity training. We are not yet at that level to explain it or to be able to explain it. So of course we are interested in, okay, what are the underlying mechanisms? Is it, for example, is it just happening out of an integrative approach where it just say, okay, this is what it is at the end, but there are multiple factors contributing into it. For sure, there is a training aspect in there. For sure, there is a nutritional and also how you can use your glycogen stores, glycogen replenishment, and also I think but it's I would even speculate it's a very integrative approach. You won't find that key marker of, okay, with this someone is getting fatigue resistance and with this someone is not. I think that would be too simple because it's such a complex phenomenon where you just have to be aware that what you are observing here can be a product of many, many things. And honestly, if you really want to be very critical about this work, there is one very big limitation, what you can just not play down. And it's the thing of the influence of race tactics. So the real question is, as we had no access to, we could not measure lactate during the race. So, or even oxygen equivalence, whatever. So perception of effort or whatever. The problem was that we don't know, was the decline in power output due to team tactics because his job was done, or was it due to because he was over the limit? So that, that is for sure some kind of discussion, what needs to be said. Because when you look at the race, it's just like, or when you look at Tour de France races, when domestic all of a sudden just leave and basically drop. Do they it cautiously, or can they do anymore? And I think that's one aspect what we try to answer more in a formal way. And this is where now our research interest is going for the future.
I think there can probably be several PhD studies on the topic of fatigue resistance alone. That's a really fascinating topic, and I'm also waiting for somebody to do something in Ironman racing.
Yeah, in triathlon, I would even say, in triathlon, I would love to do it, because fatigue resistance in Ironman is like I would even say the number one metric to choose.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. One question here that I noted is that when you looked at the training characteristics over the year for the under 23s, then I think you noted that the training volume and intensity was lower in the late season than it was in mid season and early season. And we're talking here about the racing part of the season. So what do you think that is the reason for that? Is it that they had accumulated too much fatigue, or for some reason due to racing, or is it something else? Well, what do you think the reason is, and do you think there is something that could maybe be done to change that, to be able to maintain a bit more consistency?
When we did the study and when we found this out, this was basically also retrospectively analyzed. So the season was, of course, it was not that we prospectively want to manipulate these things. There was no manipulation on training at all from our design. So basically what we say, okay, we did some kind of standardized testing, some kind of standardized efforts and so on. Of course, there was standardization in the design behind, but we always said it should not influence the training outcome of the athlete, because we want to initially use it as a learning effect for us to know how can we do better. And for sure, the things what are happening at the end of the season are twofold. I think there is a strategic component, which is just say, okay, this is how a season flows with the dynamics of the racing, race days, and so on. But also, I think there is a subjective component of the athlete and coach relationship where they just might target or might rethink their seasonal buildup, that they don't need to rush to be in top shape in April, that they say, okay, let's just gradually build through into the season. And we had this year a great example of how it can be realized. It was Georg Steinhauser, who is now going to Education First. He had a very gradual build-up, and he was peaking by Tour de l'Avenir, and also thereafter having his best seasonal period ever. So we basically learning from this aspect on a day-to-day basis, and also on an athlete-to-athlete approach. At that time, we didn't know, but we tried to reinforce this better in order to make less mistakes also from the coaching side.
Yeah, no, I think it kind of aligns very well with the previous point already, but I think this is something that I also see quite a bit in athletes, that maybe just pacing your season a bit better in terms of both training and racing is a mistake that a lot of us make, just being a bit or ambitious maybe in the early parts of the season, and then that costing us later, not just in terms of races and performances, but also just in the ability to train as much or as intensely as we did early on. So I think that was an interesting point that you brought up there. Now, just a couple of general questions. So first, can you give 3 pieces of advice about anything related to endurance sports for amateur triathletes or cyclists or endurance athletes that want to improve their performance?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the simple principles of training well, training good, recover well, eat well, sleep well. I think it's just very simple. I think it's very simple in endurance type of sports. Just follow the basics, right? And that's the most difficult thing to do, because what you observed is that athletes, not only age group athletes, but also we see this in pro athletes, pro cyclists as well. They are so obsessed with all these new kind of technological measurements, with HRV, with all those trackers and so on, and they just loosening the head of themselves. And that's one problem where they just, I think, subconsciously cannot recover adequately as they should. There is a lot of influence also from social media, Instagram and so on, because they need to look good on the training ride. They need to take photos on a training ride. They need to tell how much they're training every day. So there is a lot of influence what really keeps you from training well. And I think basically going back to the roots and say, okay, what do I really need for the training is quite simple and can be done quite straightforward. And I think reframing this from an athlete side, but also as a coach side, and stressing this on a day-to-day basis, I think that's the key to go. And then I think there are no secrets.
Yeah, I love it. Getting the basics right. It reminds me of something I saw on Twitter yesterday. Somebody posted a page from a book, and it's a page with the headline, "How to be more impressive." And it says, suppose we want to publish something that is as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. Then there's a whole bunch of math. And at the last line of the page, we see something like ln of the limit from Z to infinity of 1 plus. I won't go on and read everything, but it's basically a long line of math that also means 1 + 1 = 2. And for most, it's just pure jibber jabber and doesn't mean anything. But I think that I was thinking about training when I saw that post, and like getting the basics right. That's what it's about, and making things overly complex doesn't really. 1 + 1 is still 2, even if you write it in a way that looks incredibly impressive. So I think that's something that.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
I
And I think
really agree with.
I think that's a problem also what we have a bit in sports science. Even a lot of coaches and scientists, they want to sound exclusively knowledgeable, exclusively intelligent, and they just forget to keep things simple, and simplify also the language you are using with athletes. Don't overcomplicate things. Don't explain them underlying physiology if they are not interested. There is no point to always boost your knowledge on public places. So I think be a bit more conservative about this and just acknowledge the beauty of training and having fun.
Yeah, and of course, it's not easy to get the basics right. It's very difficult to get the right balance of training load and recovery. So that's not to say that it's very easy or anything. It is difficult, but it's just more simple than we sometimes make it be. And then, what's one thing that you're currently learning about or studying or fascinated by, and why?
I would say I'm learning the whole time. It's basically it's you never stop. You should never stop learning, or that's my credo. It's really something I'm into it. There's hardly a day where I'm not interested in any new aspects of sports science. Definitely, but I try to reframe it better, and I try to use it now with a bit of also. Giving myself time to absorb. I didn't do this quite well in the past, but now I realized, it's better to spend a morning ski touring with James, for example, in order to reflect a bit about the work, about what we are doing, rather than stucking in the office and try to desperately write on something where you just don't make any progress. So having that life balance, back to it. Was quite an important change for me, and this is something what I really now enjoy.
Okay, so your answer about what you're learning about would be really the kind of work-life balance. Is that it?
That's exactly the bottom line.
Okay, perfect. And now finally, let's take the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to endurance sports or science?
I have to mention John A. Hawley and Louisa Burke, Peak Performance, because they dedicated such a nice letter to me when I finished my PhD. They are very great friends with Inigo, and they surprised me with a personal written letter and the book, and that was something very impressive for me. And that has now a big it's now a big picture in my office. So it's Peak Performance by Louisa Burke and John A. Hawley.
Perfect. And what's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
It's definitely team spirit. It's I would even say the embrace of the suck sometimes, because this is where you learn. I think being humble, being appreciative, and just enjoy what you are doing.
Yeah. And finally, who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
It's my grandpa, because I finally managed to live in the same house than him. I got a new apartment renovated there, and he's 85. He's still doing his morning gymnastics every day, 20 pull-ups. He's super fit. He's still skiing, and he is a really, really idol to myself.
That is incredibly impressive. 20 pull-ups at 85. Wow, that is some going. And finally, Peter, where can listeners find more about you and follow you on social media, ResearchGate, and places like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on ResearchGate as well. I'm on Twitter. But more recently, I also created a company alongside Dan Lorang and James Regg. It's called Intercept, which is basically a platform for sports science support regarding teams, federations, or individual athletes.
Okay, cool. I didn't know that, but I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So great. And thank you so much. It's been great to hear more about your work and the really impressive work. Congratulations on getting that PhD finalized as well. And good luck for the future of your career.
Thank you very much for the opportunity being in the podcast. And I'm a great consumer of your work, and keep it going.
Thanks. I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, where we'll have plenty of links to Peter's Twitter and ResearchGate, as well as all of the studies included in his PhD and the PhD thesis itself. We will also have links to All Out Physiology, which is a YouTube channel by Dr. Mark Burnley we mentioned, and a blog post on exercise intensity domains and phase transitions, which is the blog post by Dr. Mark Burnley we talked about. Also, I have linked to the tools and calculators that Felipe Mattioni has developed, and I will look forward to checking them out myself. I haven't done so yet at the moment of recording this. And we mentioned a number of names of guests that have appeared in the past on the podcast. So I have tried to link to as many of them as possible in the show notes. I won't name anybody, but there's a ton of them in the show notes and episode description links. If you need any help with your training to take your endurance performance to the next level, then consider getting a scientific triathlon training plan or get started with one of our coaches. We are very confident in the quality of our services. We have helped a large number of athletes improve significantly and hope that we can do that for you as well. Next Monday, we will have another episode, of course, and I have done several great interviews over the last couple of weeks by the time of recording this, but I haven't really decided which one to schedule next, so you'll have to wait and see. But stay subscribed to the podcast, of course, and you will see that on Monday when it is released. Big thanks finally to our sponsors, Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses, and get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. And thank you to Senate. Use the Senate swim trainer to improve your technique, power, and stamina, and increase your consistency of swim training, even when you don't have time to go to the pool. Get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can get on senateswimtrainer.com/TTS. And remember that it's a risk-free investment. You can get a full refund if you don't love the trainer after 2 weeks. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.